Hello guys, so you clearly loved the last two videos where I debunked and analyzed claims made by other language learning creators. And as a professional people pleaser, I feel obliged to give the people what they want. That's just who I am, and you're welcome. Before we start, I need to address something that made me cackle. In the last two videos, the creators I reacted to were both bald with incredible beards, which was honestly completely unintentional, by the way. But apparently one of you thinks I only debunk bald guys. So just so you don't start thinking I have a type, this time we are covering someone with hair and no facial hair. See, you make fun of me, and this is why we can't have nice things anymore. Oh, one more thing, in the previous video someone complained I was making too many gay jokes, and I'd just like to say, honey, if you're uncomfortable with men giving other men compliments, focus on those feelings first and then come back to my content. How about that? Okay, back to the video. This week I'm reacting to the first 5 minutes of a video made by Xiaoma NYC. And I don't know why, but every time I think of Xiaoma, which is obviously every day, I think of Sammy saying Xiaomanik.
Today I will show you the master scammer Xiaoma.
This lives in my head rent-free, I swear. Anyway, the video we are reacting to today is called How I Learned to Speak Any Language in 24 Hours, and in it, Xiaoma explains his method and makes some interesting claims. Let's just say that. And just to be clear, this series is not about hating on anyone. Xiaoma and I, we cool. He even invited me on one of his live streams back during COVID, so no hate, and links will be in the description box below. Anyway, let's go.
I learned to speak 56 languages, and I learned each of them in under 24 hours. Yes, I know that sounds a little bit ridiculous, even to me, but it is true. And it's actually the only way that I could have posted 56 videos of me surprising strangers by speaking their language in just the past few years.
Okay, first of all, 56 languages is definitely impressive, regardless of his level of proficiency in them. You know, let's give credit where credit is due. However, when you hear claims like this, it's really important to look at the keywords. Here that's speak, learn, and honestly, I'd even add under 24 hours. First, I think Xiaoma knows he's being a bit cheeky with how he's using speak and learn, because the ambiguity of those words is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. And as language content creators, we know how to feed the algorithm monster, let's just say that. As far as I know, he's only fluent in English, Mandarin, and Cantonese, and he can kind of dabble in Spanish. The rest is mostly basic conversations across his videos with very predictable answers to questions like, why do you speak X language, or where are you from, and things like that. Which is still impressive, I don't want to take that away from him. I definitely can't do that myself, but it's important to contextualize these claims. As for the 24 hours, I actually think he's telling the truth. As I said in the introduction, I was part of one of his live streams where he learned French in 12 hours, and he did really well. I mean, he had great tutors, obviously, but he was still at an A1 level by the end of it, which is completely normal. That's what you would expect after 12 hours of French.
So I've talked about this before, but I was actually terrible at learning languages in high school. Not that I got bad grades, my grades were actually pretty good, but I just couldn't actually speak any of these languages that I studied. I would just see this language textbook full of super intimidating alphabets and scripts and charts and tones and just become totally overwhelmed.
Okay, so here we have a pretty typical setup. The speaker struggles with language learning, feels overwhelmed, and then eventually they see the light. I mean, fair enough, it's storytelling, it's part of the character development, if you will. I do feel bad for him though, because the role of a teacher is to make language as accessible as possible, and feeling intimidated by a language is just not a fun way to learn. But I'm glad he stuck with it and went on to become a fluent speaker of Mandarin. You know, who doesn't love a happy ending?
You know, and having grown up in a monolingual English-speaking environment in the United States, I would just think to myself, man, it's either geniuses or Dutch people who can actually learn to speak multiple languages. And I really wanted to learn to speak, but I would try by reading the textbook, which is how I thought you were supposed to learn a language, but I would inevitably get bogged down in the details and then just totally give up.
Again, I do feel bad for him, but at the same time, it's not that surprising to me that he struggled to speak based on what he's describing. And I'm not saying this to judge him, by the way. I'm just explaining how this works for those of you watching. Because let's be honest, he was probably just a kid at the time, so of course he wouldn't know. I mean, he wasn't a teacher. But basically, you don't learn to speak a language just by reading it. I mean, you can try, but good luck. When I was training to be a teacher, one of the key things we learned is that if you want to speak a language, you need a lot of exposure to it. You need to hear it being used. And especially in the early stages, reading isn't going to help you much with speaking. Just like hearing a language isn't really going to help you with writing, at least not when it comes to spelling.
But after I moved to China and started learning Chinese, I started experimenting more and more with language learning on my YouTube channel. And especially since it became my full-time job a few years ago, I actually started getting really, really good at learning languages. To the point where now, I consider myself possibly the world's leading expert on how to learn a language as quickly as possible, which, by the way, does not make me anything close to the world's greatest polyglot. There are millions of people in this world who have way better language skills than I do, but having gone from zero to basic conversational ability in 56 languages from every continent on the planet except Antarctica, I do think that I at least have some experience in the topic of how to learn any language quickly.
Okay, so this is where I would push back a little bit, because yes, he has experience. Reaching basic conversational ability in multiple languages is impressive. But again, we need to be careful with definitions, because getting to a basic conversational level quickly is one thing. Understanding how language learning works as a whole is something else entirely. It would be a bit like me saying, I've made nearly 300 videos on YouTube, so I'm a social media expert. At most, I can claim experience, but calling it expertise is a bit hyperbolical. It would go hard on LinkedIn, though.
See, what I realize the problem with typical language textbooks is that they front load too much. You have to learn all of these alphabets and weird scripts and charts and tones and grammar before you even get to chapter 1. They're these incredibly boring and by themselves useless things that you're somehow just expected to memorize out of context.
So regarding this claim, I can say with about 99% certainty that this basically never happens. Or maybe I'm just being delusional, who knows. To me, this is more of a stereotype of textbooks and formal education. Unless you're using something from like the 50s, it's pretty rare to be asked to memorize a bunch of things completely out of context before you even start. Now, to be fair, the only non-Latin script I've personally studied is Japanese, so maybe there are some textbooks out there that do it the way he's describing, but I've never really seen it as the standard approach. Let me show you quickly how textbooks are usually structured. I promise I'll try not to turn this into a lecture. The textbook I'm going to use to illustrate my point is Entre nous 3. It's for B1 level. I'm not saying it's the best French textbook out there, but I'm just using it as an example because I think it's structured quite well. So usually the way books are structured is by chapters or units. It used to be the case that some books would sort of title or be divided by grammar points, but here in modern language learning methods for textbooks, it's by themes. So the first chapter of this book is called En route. Sorry, it's a bit tricky to show a textbook on camera, but it's basically about tourism, traveling, and that kind of stuff. The first thing you see in the first pages is cultural elements with text, images. Then you have some texts around the topic with historical figures, places to visit, I think. I'm just sort of quickly explaining. I'm not really reading what I'm seeing. And then here, for the first time, you get grammar, which is only a few pages in. So it's not like front-loading. If anything, it's giving a lot of context and input through the form of reading. And then it's introducing the grammar. So the idea is that when you start a unit, you will have new words, but it's not even a vocab list. It's just words naturally, quote unquote, present in the text, which you will encounter. And then it's up to you as a student to, work on remembering those words as you go along. And that's how you progress. And then you get some grammar. This one is revision because it's B1 level, but it's not like grammar intensive, honestly. And you'll notice that grammar is not decontextualized because whenever you have a grammar point, you have first some kind of text which sort of shows the grammar in action. So it's not like you're learning the grammar first, which used to be how it was done a long time ago. Now, language textbooks prefer, because that's like what the science advises, if you will, or suggests to do, which is to first start with context, like input, if you will, and then doing the grammar once you've seen it in context. I hope that made sense, and I hope I explained it clearly. So yes, textbooks do teach grammar, but it's not usually the main focus of each unit, and it's introduced progressively throughout the book. Now, I'm not saying all textbooks are perfect. Maybe my 99% figure earlier was a bit exaggerated. There are definitely bad ones out there. I've used in the past Japanese textbooks that were very grammar heavy, and I've even had to teach with a beginner Portuguese textbook which almost had no input at all, which honestly sucked. But as a teacher, I can work around that. I can bring in my own resources, materials, and balance things out. The problem is when you're learning on your own, because those kinds of textbooks are often designed for classroom use. And they don't always work well without a teacher guiding you. See, we're not completely useless.
And it isn't just textbooks that teach like this. This forms the basis of our language learning pedagogy in almost all language learning classrooms around the world. And while I do understand the desire to create a solid foundation, I think you end up instead intimidating beginners and mystifying language learning. You make language learning feel like calculus when it's actually much easier than that.
That really shouldn't be the case though if you have a good teacher with up-to-date training or a good self-study textbook, which are actually becoming more and more common.
Don't get me wrong, learning languages is hard, but as Matt versus Japan likes to say, it's hard in the way that exercise is hard, not in the way that calculus is hard. It does not take a genius to go jogging, but it does take a certain level of commitment. And this textbook style, by the way, is also not the way that 99% of people who actually succeed at learning languages actually learn their languages.
Okay, so the exercise versus calculus analogy is actually pretty good. I love a good analogy. Yes, learning a language does require effort and consistency more than raw intelligence. But the 99% figure he gives is obviously not realistic because it's based on a pretty inaccurate idea of how textbooks actually work, as I hope I demonstrated. Also, shout out to Matt if he sees this. I've had very interesting interviews with him twice on the channel, and I will link the videos below if you're interested.
A really interesting example of this is that most Chinese teachers like to teach you Chinese characters on day one before you even learn to speak, because that's how they first learned Chinese when they went to elementary school in China. But what this overlooks is that on their first day of elementary school in China, they already spoke fluent Mandarin, which they had learned word by word, phrase by phrase, sentence by sentence from their parents and not from a textbook. So by the time they were learning the writing system, they already understood the entire essence of Mandarin speaking and grammar, to which they could then apply the characters.
He actually brings up a very good point here. You can't structure learning for L2 learners the same way you do for L1 learners. The starting point is completely different, so the approach has to be different too. Now, I can't really speak for how Chinese is taught since I've never learnt it, let alone taught it. So if you know, feel free to let me know in the comments section below. I'm outsourcing this part of the video. But for Japanese, it actually does make sense to learn hiragana and katakana early on. These are the basic writing systems in Japanese, and they allow you to move away from the Latin alphabet, which is a good thing if you're serious about learning the language. That being said, learning those is very different from learning complex Chinese characters because there's only 100 simple Japanese characters to learn. One thing I should say is that some textbooks do try to teach those progressively, so even then it's not always the case that you have to master them before even starting to learn the language, but it's just one way of going about it, I guess.
So my system has two parts, and part one is speaking practice. The key to my rapid language learning is spending 1 hour per day speaking with online tutors or friends. And I do this for 10 to 15 sessions spread out over 3 weeks. The focus here is purely on practical conversation skills. I start from zero, from very basic phrases, and then we gradually build up to more and more complex conversations. And I think speaking from the very beginning, literally day one, is crucial because it helps to demystify the language, and it also helps to get over your fear of speaking, which is precisely the problem that I had in high school when I would spend all this time studying my textbooks, and then when it came to actually speak, I would be petrified. I wouldn't know what to say because I had never actually spoken before.
While the premise of his method is a bit skewed, I do think his approach makes sense. If your goal is simply to have basic conversations in the language, then honestly, who's to stop you? I know many people get a bit weird about those who focus on just one skill, like only speaking or only reading or only listening, but it's not like you have to max out every stat before you're allowed to play the game. At the end of the day, your goals in language learning are your own, and there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you're aware aware of the trade-offs. For example, if you focus only on speaking, you might not be able to fully navigate the language in other contexts. And that's okay, as long as you know that going in. On the topic of conversation classes, I've done quite a few conversation classes with Japanese tutors, and I think they're great. It's also a very humbling experience. I might even do a few more before my upcoming trip to Japan, just to, kind of give myself a bit of a boost. Or maybe a reality check.
An analogy that I often use is that trying to learn to speak a language by reading a textbook is like trying to learn to ride a bike by reading a textbook. You're just studying the physics of how your feet move and the rotations at this number of RPM create this movement. So all I have to do is turn left into the torque, and we've all been brainwashed by school into thinking that's how it works, but it's not. And in theory, maybe it is possible to learn how to ride a bike by reading a physics textbook, but practically speaking, you do need to understand the rhythm of bike riding and actually ride a bike in order to learn how to ride a bike.
Okay, I actually like this part because it's a good example of a bad analogy, in my opinion. Textbooks are not the equivalent of physics when it comes to learning how to ride a bike. If anything, that would be linguistics. And as much as I love linguistics, it's not designed to teach you a language, it's designed to explain how a language works. But if we stick with that analogy, a textbook is much closer to someone showing you or describing the movements you need to make to actually get the bike moving, or maybe adding training wheels. And then immersion would be like watching people ride or just getting on the bike yourself and hoping for the best. This more accurate version of the analogy actually illustrates well that both are useful. Being told how to do it is your grammar, and seeing how it's used, that's your immersion, and both play a role in learning. Alright guys, so that's all I have for you today. I hope you found this useful and that you enjoyed this third episode of the debunking series, which still doesn't have a name. I'm open to suggestions. As usual, the main goal of these videos is to show you how convincing something can sound online when it's said with confidence, until you actually start poking holes in it. If you come across other videos like this and you're thinking, wait, what the fuck? Feel free to send them my way. Ideally, don't put links in the comments because I think sometimes they can get treated as spam and I might not see them. Anyway, if you've watched the video until the end, I'd like you to drop a bike emoji. Here we go. Anyway, thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.